All right, I'm starting to see participant entry slowing down, so I'll kick off this webinar. Hello, I'm Elisa Peterson. I'm the Federal Policy Manager here at RMI, and thank you for attending this webinar titled Post-IRA Economics of Home and Vehicle Decarbonization, How the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund Can Fill the Financing Gap. Quite a mouthful, probably could have streamlined that. Thank you for joining us to talk about this important topic. A quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on RMI's event page within 24 hours of the event. We'll send that recording out to everyone who's registered, along with other resources and contacts. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the live Q&A at the end. This webinar will be about an hour long. So we have a pretty packed agenda. We'll start off with Whitney discussing the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, just a high-level overview of what that looks like. Then Ryan will talk about the Green Upgrade Calculator, which is a new tool RMI is developing. Then we'll go into sector-specific economics, starting off with residential solar PV, then single-family home electrification, next personal electric vehicles, and then we'll close with some remarks from Doug with Justice Climate Fund, and then there will be some time for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll pass it over to Whitney to talk through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund.
Thank you, Elisa. Hi, everyone. I'm Whitney Mann. I'm a manager on RMI's climate finance team. I work really across RMI's GGRF efforts, so it can be a good point of contact for any questions you might have about our work. And to that end, today am starting with just a brief level set on what the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is. I imagine this is old news and something that many of you know well, so if that's true, permission to maybe tune out for a few minutes, but we want everyone to have a bit of a baseline, so do not sign off because we're about to get into more of the details with Ryan and Elisa shortly. So, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. This program came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. It is hosted by the EPA. It is the single largest investment in the Inflation Reduction Act in low-income and disadvantaged communities, and it is set up by 3 buckets of funding. So I'm going to quickly walk through how each of those buckets of funding works. The first is the National Clean Investment Fund. This is a $14 billion pot of funding that EPA will grant to 2 to 3 national nonprofits. These nonprofits are then expected to invest in projects that meet qualified project standards and across the GGRF's priority project categories, which are net zero buildings, zero emissions transportation, and distributed generation and storage. Qualified projects are those that reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants, that also provide additional benefits to communities beyond emissions reduction, so things like affordable housing or workforce benefit. There are also projects that otherwise would not have been financed, so projects that are not covered by other Inflation Reduction Act or other available public incentives, or that private markets are not necessarily inclined to invest in without some concessional financing or credit enhancements. They also mobilize private capital in their projects that are commercial, so not first-of-a-kind projects. So NCIF awardees have pretty flexible financing authorities. They can provide financial assistance really in any form besides for subgrants for these priority projects. So some examples of these include rooftop solar, solar plus storage, building retrofits and electrification. That's also new construction as well as retrofits, EV charging infrastructure. The list is more expansive than this. These are just some examples of projects that would be considered priority projects and could be considered qualified projects if they meet those other thresholds. So the second competition is called the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. This is a competition that will award 2 to 7 hub nonprofits. Separate or different from the last competition, 100% of these grants need to ultimately benefit low income and disadvantaged communities. For the last competition, the threshold is only 40%. These awardees provide really just subgrants, so that's the exclusive financial mechanism, and those subgrants go to capitalize and provide technical assistance to a national network of clean financing leaders. So these would be new or existing green financing entities. Recipients could include community lenders, green banks, things like that. It has the same types of priority projects as the NCIF, a slightly higher threshold because the CCA awardees need to invest exclusively in priority projects. So that net zero buildings, zero emissions transportation, distributed generation and storage. And the NCIF awardees are meant to invest across those priority projects, but it's a bit looser of a threshold. And then finally, the Solar for All competition is the most distinct of the three. It has the most awards by far, so up to 60 states, tribal, and municipal governments, and eligible nonprofits. Similar to CCIA, this competition will have 100% benefit for low-income and disadvantaged communities. It also has the smallest set of qualified, or I should say priority projects. So this funding is meant to expand existing or create new solarized programs. So the priority projects are rooftop solar, community solar, and enabling upgrades. So also flexible financing support. It's the debt, equity, hybrid credit enhancements, as well as subsidies and subgrants. So really a bit of everything, but the smallest priority project list. So that's the quick 101 on the GGRF competitions. If you're interested in more information, please don't hesitate to reach out, but hopefully that gives you foundation that you need for the rest of Elisa's and Ryan's presentations. So with that, I will pass back to them.
Okay, so for the next part, we're going to be walking through a sneak peek of the Green Upgrade Calculator, which is a tool that we'll be releasing later this month and used for this presentation. And my name is Ryan Shea. I'm a manager within our buildings program and have worked a lot on this calculator over the last year and related residential analyses. So for this calculator, it's really an online tool for energy professionals to analyze different upgrades to a home or transportation system, things like rooftop solar and storage, weatherization, heat pumps, EVs, e-bikes, etc. And enables energy professionals to understand the operating and lifetime economic and climate impacts of those upgrades. And there's largely two different types of analyses. One is for individual homes. So this is where, for example, a financial institution could project lifetime cost impacts of different financing terms, loan rates, etc., on various upgrades, or a contractor could look at an individual home to modify a system design specification, project bill impacts. And similarly, a home advisor could look at lifetime costs and climate impacts of different quotes for a homeowner. And then the other type of analysis is where you leverage the API part of the calculator to run a regional analysis. So this could be someone like a policy advisor to analyze the impacts of a proposed policy, or an analyst to map out different economic or climate impacts of different upgrades across a region or across the US. And that's what we did for this presentation. So giving sort of a sneak peek look at what this will look like when we release it later this month, but also an FYI in terms of how we're using it for some of the cost results that we'll go through later in the presentation. So with that, I'll pass it back to Elisa.
Thanks, Ryan. So now we'll go through the residential solar PV slides. Each of the sector slides will follow a similar format. We'll start off with market size, then we'll go into typical costs, then we'll go into IRA incentives associated with them. Then we'll talk about operating costs and payback, and we'll end with financing considerations. So looking at the residential solar market, right now, the market size is about 18 billion, but that could double by 2030. This is an analysis done by Wood Mackenzie, and I would say it's relatively conservative. We are seeing that residential solar installations have increased year after year historically, and this is kind of assuming that they're increasing at a similar rate. When I was looking through market size, there were many that kind of did this linear growth, and then many that followed more of an S curve. So I would say that we know it's very likely that the residential solar market's going to go up. It's just kind of a question of how much. And of these residential solar projects, the vast majority of them received equity or debt financing. So if we're walking through a typical rooftop solar project, the economics change quite a bit depending on various factors. The first is kind of what's the size of the system. We assumed a typical size was 7 kilowatts, but this is going to vary widely depending on roof size, whether there's net metering policy, and whether it's an all-electric building or if it's electric and gas. For the relative upfront cost, we assume $2.85 per watt. But again, this varies quite a bit based on system size, where it's installed, and how comfortable the contractors are with the solar equipment. So if we add those two together, that means that the upfront cost is roughly $20,000. So quite a big chunk of change. And there is a federal tax credit that we'll talk about in more detail that cuts that cost by 30%, but it still results in an upfront cost of about $14,000. So significant upfront cost for residential solar. Now, IRA, I often refer to it as a game changer, but I will say with the residential investment tax credit, it really isn't much of a game changer. This tax credit already existed. It already was a 30% investment tax credit. We tried to make it refundable, meaning that if you didn't have tax liability, that you could still take advantage of it, and that didn't make it into the final text. And so what that created is a residential tax credit that is useful to middle and high income Americans, but not super useful to low income Americans that don't have tax liability. The other kind of major issue with this is that roofing material is not covered in the residential ITC. So if you need to do like a roof replacement in order to put solar on your roof, that's not covered through the investment tax credit. Where major changes were made with IRA is in the commercial investment tax credit. And you might think, why are we talking about this? Because this is residential solar. But the commercial investment tax credit is very relevant to residential solar because oftentimes the solar developers do third-party ownership, and they pass a portion of the incentives through to the resident. And so that third-party ownership might look like a power purchase agreement or a solar lease. And previously, this was kind of always possible, but what's new with the commercial investment tax credit under IRA is that they made it eligible where if you're a non-taxable entity, so if you're a city or if you're a nonprofit CDFI, you can actually take advantage of this tax credit through direct pay, which was not possible before. So instead of just having the solar developer be the owner of the system, now there's a kind of a whole new wave of possibilities for potential owners for third-party models. Oh, and the other big thing with the commercial investment tax credit is that it is up to a 70% investment tax credit, which is just wild. To do this, you have to meet a bunch of different requirements. 10% is for meeting domestic content requirements, 10% is being located in an energy community, and then 20% is if your project economically benefits low-income households. And this could either be through like a multifamily affordable housing project, or if it's located in a low-income community. And then finally, there's Solar for All, which Whitney covered, but just to kind of double click on, there are Solar for All is different than the other programs in that you can receive rebates through it. So depending on the Solar for All program, there might be up to 60 different Solar for All programs. Those incentive amounts will vary quite a bit and could dramatically impact the economics of solar. I'll pass it back to Ryan.
Okay, great. So the next part here is applying that green upgrade calculator that I referenced to building inventories in every state to get a sense of what are the annual operating savings that homeowners could typically see by installing a typical rooftop solar system in their state. And as you can see, it ranges quite a bit from around $500 to over $3,000, and really varies across the US depending on a few things. One is the system size. So obviously a larger system, a bigger home will have bigger savings. The solar resource or the amount of sunshine in that area, the electricity rate. So if electricity rates are super high, solar will offset that and have higher savings, as well as the state net metering policy. So what value the homeowner gets for selling their excess generation back to the grid. And when you apply all that together, this is sort of the snapshot that you get across the US. And then if we also apply both the upfront costs that Elisa talked about and the operating savings, then we can get a snapshot of the simple payback. And the simple payback, being how many years it takes to pay back that initial investment, is really highly dependent on the market prices and tax credit that Elisa mentioned, and then the operating savings that I just walked through. And when we include 25C, here's a snapshot across the US where 42 states have a payback less than 15 years. And the states that have a payback higher than that are states typically with lower electricity prices, lower solar resource, and or not a great net metering policy. But when we remove 25C, so for some of those lower income residents that don't have tax liability, there's a higher net upfront cost. So it takes longer to pay back. So only around 30 states having a payback less than 15 years. So that just sort of conveys the impact that the upfront operating savings have, as well as the impact of 25C that Elisa went through. Okay, and with that, I'll pass it back to Elisa.
Great. And so I mentioned before that low-income communities have not benefited proportionately from solar. And there are a few reasons for that. The first is just the high upfront cost. Oftentimes, low-income households don't just have that capital laying around that they can use on solar. Similarly, if roof repairs are needed, they are not able to finance that. And then there's also electric panel upgrades that can be required with solar. Now, the 25C, the residential and commercial tax credit do cover the electric panel upgrades, but just 30% of it. So there's kind of an additional financing gap there. Additionally, if you're doing a residential solar project, depending on where you're located and the season, you might get really high savings one month and you might get lower savings the other month. Maybe there's snow cover on the panel. And so this uneven income stream can be particularly difficult for low-income households to have to front. And then I mentioned this tax monetization, the tax credit monetization challenge. And what that means is if you don't have tax liability and you're using the residential investment tax credit, our analysis shows that 4 in 10 households can't benefit from the ITC at all. And 7 in 10 households can't receive that full benefit in year one. The investment tax credit rolls over every year. So you might be able to see the full benefit, within 5 years, but it'll take longer for you to get that payback. And so one solution that RMI has been working on and that we've actually seen a CDFI try to implement in practice is this idea of, instead of the solar developer being the owner and doing some type of power purchase agreement model, actually having the nonprofit financial institution own the solar, so they can take advantage of direct pay and then do really beneficial solar loan terms to low income and moderate income households. And then once, especially if they're able to take advantage of up to 70% investment tax credit, they might be able to pay off that solar loan pretty quickly and pass ownership over to the low and moderate income households. I do want to mention there is one CDFI that I'm aware of. There might be more that is working on this, which is Capital Good Fund. And so they're in the early stages, but have done a few projects in this way. So exciting place to watch. And RMI is working on a resource kind of mapping out this concept a little bit more as well. So now we'll go to single family home electrification. When I say single family home electrification, we're going to focus on space heating, air source heat pumps, and hot water heat pumps. Within building energy efficiency and beneficial electrification, there are a bunch of different projects possible, like induction stoves or weatherization projects. And the green upgrade calculator actually also covers those, but just for timing, we're just covering these two. So if we're looking at the current residential heat pump market size, it's about $10 billion. And we think that could grow sixfold by 2030, which is a pretty massive growth opportunity. These charts were created by Rewiring America. And what they look at is they look at what would the electric heat pump sales and heat pump water heater sales need to look like in order to get on an S curve to be climate aligned. And so these are certainly ambitious projections. For the solar one, it was more of a conservative projection. This is definitely an ambitious projection, but we are seeing some indicators that an ambitious projection might make sense. First of all, this year was the first year that heat pump installations passed new furnace installations. And then last year, US Climate Alliance set a new heat pump target where members agreed to collectively reach 20 million heat pump installations across the coalition, which would quadruple the heat pump installations by 2030. So pretty major commitment by US Climate Alliance, kind of indicating that we are looking at potentially more of an S curve for growth than a more linear model. For the heat pump water heater sales, right now, you'll notice that the market's extremely low. This is because this is relatively new technology. So that would be a much larger market growth and kind of another place to watch, in that there probably isn't a lot of familiarity with the heat pump water heater and financing these, but there likely will need to be moving forward. So going into the cost now, we'll start with the air source heat pump cost. We're going to use $18,000 as a typical cost, but you can see the range is quite broad, from $12,000 to $25,000. One of the biggest things that drives this range is whether it's a cold climate heat pump or just a typical heat pump. If you're in Minnesota, you're probably only going to be seeing cold climate heat pumps, which does have a significant cost premium. There is a federal tax credit and federal rebates I'll go into in more detail. And so after the rebates, we see about an $8,000 upfront cost, which results in it not having any premium compared to kind of like a business as usual alternative, which would be a furnace and air conditioning replacement. But this could vary widely depending on all the factors above. So it could be anywhere from $6,000 cheaper to the alternative to $10,000 more expensive. For the heat pumps, where heat pump water heaters, the upfront cost is about $5,000. Again, quite the range. This varies by tank size, and also, like I mentioned, that the heat pump market is a little bit less mature. So if you're going to be in a market where they haven't installed very many heat pump water heaters before, it's likely that that cost could be a little bit higher. Again, there's a federal tax credit and federal rebate that can be used for these costs, and I'll cover those in more detail. And so the cost is pretty much cut in half by the end of that, resulting in it being about $1,000 cheaper than the gas stove alternative. So talking about IRA, I will say that I think this is a place where IRA is kind of a game changer in terms of low income rebate programs. They created a new home electrification and appliance rebate program, which is $4.5 billion. And it's funded in a way where it's formula funded. So each state has access to this pot of funding. They just need to fill out an application, and DOE needs to approve that application, and then the funding will flow. So ideally, this funding will be across the entire United States. And what it looks like is that's a point of sale rebate for electric appliances. And it's very focused on low and moderate income households. You have to be below 150% area median income to be able to benefit from this rebate program. And if you're low income, you can get 100% of the project cost, up to $8,000 for a heat pump. So pretty significant savings opportunity. The other rebate program that was created follows a similar format in that it is the Home Efficiency Rebate Program. It is $4.3 billion, and it also is spread across the United States. It's formula funded, where each state gets a piece of this pie. This is designed a little bit more, I would say, more complex, where it's a whole home rebate program. And so you need to hit at least 20% savings in order to get this rebate. The rebate amount is a little bit lower. We're seeing with low income that the rebate is $8,000 per unit if you get that high level of saving 35% energy savings. Because of that, for our modeling purposes, we focused on the home electrification and appliance rebate program because we were doing the heat pumps. But if we were doing, energy efficiency, it's more likely that we'd be focused on this home efficiency rebate program. And sorry, when I said energy efficiency, I meant weatherization. And then finally, there's this tax credit, this energy efficient home improvement credit, 25C. This is kind of similar to 25D, the residential tax credit, where it's not super useful, I would say, for low income because it's non-refundable. So again, many low-income households won't have tax liability to access it. But it is a relatively generous tax credit. You can get 30% off project cost, up to $2,000 for heat pumps, including hot water heat pumps. The other thing to be aware of is that you're only eligible for this if you're in an owner-occupied home. So even if you own the home and you rent it out, you cannot use 25C for your projects. Now, what's complicated, and I think what a lot of state energy offices and contractors and consumers are struggling with, is how do all these new federal incentive programs stack with local and utility incentive programs to form a project that is the most cost effective. So I'll just walk you through an example of a cold climate air source heat pump installation in Colorado to give you a sense of kind of what the project might look like. So we'll start off with that $8,000 incentive through the home electrification and appliance rebate program. That's point of sale, so it'll be given when you purchase it, so no financing needed there. So if you're taking that $20,000 upfront cost, that's a higher upfront cost than we said earlier because it's a cold climate heat pump, and subtracting out the the HERE rebate, you still have about $12,000, actually about $13,000 that you would need to finance. What's interesting here is that Excel does have a rebate that's $2,000 for heat pumps as well, but you need to file the rebate after it's installed, and then it takes some time to process. And so there might be a need for kind of like a bridge loan here. And then for the low income household, we'll assume that they will not be able to access the federal tax credit. So now if we're looking at the same project for median income household, it looks the exact same, except for they will be able to take advantage of this federal tax credit as well. And so what's important to realize here is that the bridge loan might be two different timelines for the utility rebate versus the tax credit rebate. And so just something to be aware of when financing. And I think just worth pointing out that the low income households are actually paying more for the heat pump than the median income households, just due to how the federal incentives are structured. Back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Lisa. So Lisa went through some of the upfront costs and available incentives that are out there. I'm going to quickly talk through some of the operating impacts of home electrification and then simple payback, as we did for solar. So first off, some of the biggest impacts of home electrification operating cost impacts are the existing fuel source and climate zone. So I'll walk through 3 different types of existing fuel source and look at what the results look like across the US if a homeowner installed an air source heat pump water heater, and induction. So first is with natural gas. So in blue, where there's darker blue, bigger savings, in orange and red, bills may actually go up. But fear not, in those kind of upper Midwest and Northeast states, it is fairly common to have a hybrid heat pump with a gas backup to alleviate any of those bill increase concerns. But this is sort of how it stacks up for natural gas retrofits on average across the US. And then for delivered fuel, so things like propane and fuel oil, which there's a lot of in the Northeast, as you can see, all over the US, everywhere, there would basically be significant cost savings averaging around $1,500 a year. And then on electric resistance, a very similar story to delivered fuel, given that it's electric rates in both cases, but a significant increase in efficiency, there'd be large bill savings for electric resistance customers. So that's sort of a snapshot across the US on operating savings. Next, looking at simple payback, so how this compares with the net upfront costs. So the heat pump water heater versus the traditional replacement, what that premium cost is, how long it takes back to pay that back, including the home energy rebate programs that Elisa mentioned. For natural gas, 32 states have a payback less than their 15-year lifespan. Delivered fuel is every state except Alaska in our analysis here. And then in electric resistance, all states have very quick paybacks. So that's sort of a snapshot across the US with the home energy rebate programs that hopefully will start to be rolled out across all the states in the next year or so. And then after those programs expire, if they're not able to be renewed, what happens without the home energy rebate programs? So this is the same chart, but without, so fewer states having a payback less than 15 years for gas, but similar story with delivered fuel and electric resistance, the vast majority of states having significant savings to pay back that higher upfront cost of the installment. So with that, I think I will pass it back to Elisa to wrap up this section.
Thanks, Ryan. So there are a bunch of financial barriers preventing beneficial electrification projects. The first is the high upfront cost. Even though the cost is potentially more cost effective than the fossil fuel alternative, it's still a significant cost that is typically unplanned for. There's the split incentive issue I mentioned earlier, the delay in incentives, which I mentioned, insufficient incentives. Sometimes they don't cover as much as you'd hope, especially for cold climate heat pumps. misaligned payback periods where the loan might be shorter than the payback period of the piece of equipment. I mentioned workforce issues for some of the newer technology like heat pump water heaters. And then it's also a lot of small varied deals, which is not always ideal for lending. We would recommend greenhouse gas reduction new financial offerings that are designed to have no upfront cost and low or no interest. That would have a simple application process with instant approval. This is especially important given just that these are urgent loans that are needed, because pretty much you're doing heat pumps when your equipment breaks. Ideally, the financial offering could be coordinated through the contractor, because typically these entities, consumers listen to the contractor, and it's easiest to kind of work through them. Potentially payments are on bill. I know this is more complicated because you'd have to work across various utilities, and there would be strong consumer protections. RMI is also working on a white paper on kind of designing this type of financial model, and so more information to come on that. For personal electric vehicles, if we look back, electric vehicles have been growing every single year. We just hit 1 million sales of electric vehicles last year, and RMI's analysis does think that electric vehicles are also on the S curve. So by 2030, we think that they could be 50% of new sales, up from about 10% last year. The upfront cost varies pretty widely, but we're assuming $45,000. There is a federal tax credit that we'll cover in more detail. And so what that looks like is that there's an upfront cost of about $41,000, good amount of money. And that is still a premium over the ICE vehicles. And so if we're looking at IRA, the clean vehicle credit is the EV tax credit that you hear about a lot. This credit's been around for a while, but IRA updated it to be a little bit more stringent. And with this stringency, what that looks like is that there are new domestic content requirements. And so it's divided into 2 half credits, 1 half credit if you're able to meet the critical mineral requirements, and a half credit if you meet the battery component requirements. Many electric vehicles can't meet these requirements. So it's important to note that just because someone's purchasing an electric vehicle does not mean that they're going to be able to access this tax credit. But one thing that happened that is really exciting in IRA is that they made this tax credit transferable to the dealer. And so what that means is that even if you don't have tax liability, you can transfer the credit to the dealer and essentially turn it into a point of sale rebate, which about 70% of households weren't able to access this before due to limited tax liability. So it really opens the availability of this. They also created a credit for previously owned vehicles. This is really important because before, about 70% of people are buying used vehicles, and now there's actually an incentive to support that. There's also a qualified commercial clean vehicle tax credit, which is new. It's also a $7,500 tax credit. And what's important about this is it doesn't have the same critical mineral and domestic content requirements. And so a lot of people are using this to do essentially solar EV leasing so that they can get around those tax credit requirements. And then finally, there's a credit for electric chargers. This was opened up to individuals, and it's 30% of the cost up to $1,000, but you have to be located in a low income or rural area. That map, you can see everything in green is in a low income or rural area. So they were very generous with this definition, meaning that most projects will qualify for this. Over to you, Ryan.
All right, thanks, Lisa. And I'm just seeing not seeing the presentation anymore unless it's just me.
I think that might just be you.
Okay, yeah, I see it now. Sorry about that. So on the operating costs of electric vehicles, what we did was, because it can vary depending on the vehicle type, whether it's a truck or a sedan, et cetera, we just picked a typical hatchback and looked at what the operating savings would look like across the US. And what we found is it really varies by state based on the typical vehicle miles traveled, and then energy rates. So for example, in Wyoming, with some of the highest operating savings switching to an electric vehicle, that's because their average vehicle miles traveled is over 18,000 miles a year versus neighboring Colorado at around 11,000. So much more miles traveled as well as cheaper electricity rates. And then how this operating savings compares to that upfront cost premium that Elisa mentioned, typically around $5,000 versus a traditional gasoline vehicle, is that, let's see, someone could just make the slide move by one. It looks like I don't have control anymore. Thank you. So for payback, when including, for example, a tax credit of $37.50, the simple payback is less than 5 years in almost all of the states. And then without the tax credit, if that's $0, it is still less than 5 years in almost all of the states, but less effective than if residents are able to receive that tax credit, but still in general paying back fairly quickly given the high upfront, given the high operating cost savings. With that, I'll pass it back to Elisa.
Okay. So to wrap up, I think the big financial barriers preventing clean transportation is just that high upfront cost. The high upfront cost covers more than just electric vehicles. It's also the fact that you might need to get an electric vehicle charger in your home, or you might need to do electric panel upgrades. So the cost goes beyond just the vehicle. There's also an additional consideration of public chargers typically are less available in low-income communities. There's kind of the chicken and egg where it's only profitable if a bunch of people drive EVs, but people only want to drive EVs if there are chargers. And so funding public chargers is also kind of a key piece to getting more EVs on the road. GGRF offerings could support by thinking through financing that includes both the EV and the charger, and factoring in the total cost of ownership and evaluating the projects. As you saw, the operating cost is almost always lower for electric vehicles. And then finally, I'll just end with electric vehicles maybe aren't accessible to everyone, and there are alternatives to these, such as e-bikes or scooters, and those also have a cost premium. And so thinking through financial offerings beyond electric vehicles is also pretty important if we're thinking about clean transportation. So with that, I'll pass it over to Doug Sims with Justice Climate Fund for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Elisa, and hi, everyone. Doug Sims, Interim CEO of Justice Climate Fund. Really want to thank RMI for a tremendous presentation, very informative. And I just want to say a few words about our approach to GGRF and how it implicates some of the technologies discussed today. So a bit about Justice Climate Fund. Justice Climate Fund is a 28-member coalition that was formed by the Community Builders of Color Coalition. And the coalition really was about putting community lenders and communities first. The coalition has 28 members, but it sweeps in about 1,200 community lenders from every state, 1,019 CDFIs. We also have 75 housing finance agencies. We have 34 green banks. We have minority depository institutions. We have other kinds of lenders involved, and we're happy to have also TA providers and thought leaders like RMI, also in our coalition. So the anchor of this, of our approach is really the strategy is about how can we empower the community lenders with the capital, the market development, program admin funds to really drive change on the ground in communities. And I think when we look at, in particular, the housing sector, there's really an opportunity both in the single family, multifamily side to have transformational impacts on household health and household incomes. And I think some of the insights that RMI is offering about how to structure products we'll be looking to implement as we implement our program among our very diverse coalition. There's going to be different, I think as was indicated by the maps, there'll be different solutions for different parts of the country. And so really being able to understand what is the subsidy mix, what technologies are appropriate for each region will be an important part of this, of the infrastructure, which JCF and I'm sure other applicants, other successful applicants, assuming more successful, will be applying to their thinking around what products to roll out and which partnerships to forge with energy offices and utilities and other agencies that are a critical part of creating the capital stack for these projects. I think just to give you a flavor of some of the work already that's happening, I think it's important that we are both looking to the programs, the National Clean Investment Fund program looks to mobilize capital for ready pipelines. It also looks to create the mobilized private capital, the government capital, and also to transform markets. And I think at the core of our strategy is to take what's already working and build on it when there's not capacity to build capacity. So right now we know that, for example, one of our members, MALCAB, which is the national Latino group for asset building, which has CDFI in its network, is developing right now multifamily affordable housing developments that include decarbonization projects. We know that another one of our members, the African American Alliance of CDFI CDOs, has members that are doing projects right now in Florida. We know that all over Native communities, OESTA is doing projects that are also leading edge in those communities by providing the capital and the training to those intermediaries and trade association leaders to empower their networks. We're going to go further, faster, and deeper. It's also really important as we look at this opportunity that we ensure that there's community accountability in all of our investments, that we're not worsening inequalities, but actually are remediating them. And so a critical part of our strategy is to ensure that we have mechanisms, but at every level, at the project level of community lenders, at our level, at the board level, JCF, and having advisory committees to ensure that accountability, that the projects are actually making a difference on the ground. And the last thing I'll just mention is having important cultural competence, and that we have this diverse set of communities all over the country that need to benefit from this opportunity. We need to show up in those communities, being able to know how they communicate, what their sensitivities are, and how to leverage their strengths in moving forward. So I think having a diverse group of partners like the CDFI in our network, like the green banks, like RMI, like Greenlining, and others will allow us to really advance a holistic and effective program both from the NCIF side, and also we're applying for the CCIA to create new community lenders that can have these same sorts of capacities and have the opportunity to grow with the right capital and the right partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. We do have it does seem like there's so much opportunity around GGRF, and a lot of people are wanting to make sure that they're updating community lenders and getting them prepared for the funding that's going to be released soon. And so with that, I'll just pass it to UC to share a little bit about what Inclusive and UNH is doing in that space.
Thank you so much, Elisa, Whitney, our friends at RMI. This is a fantastic webinar. I just put a link in the chat that I'm hoping you can share with the group more broadly, not just the hosts and panelists. I'm UC Terrell, Training Director for the University of New Hampshire's Center for Impact Finance at the Carsey School of Public Policy. We have been building out the trainings in preparation for the incredible demand for climate finance-related trainings. And thank you for the opportunity to share. We currently offer a consumer solar lending training, and we've served 700 individuals from over 400 CFIs to develop a new consumer lending product and to improve their capitalization and deployment strategies. This is an 8-week cohort-based instructor-led course that is really towards these applied outcomes in developing your consumer solar lending product. Starting in late April, we'll also offer a green home improvement lending course. This is for lenders to build and deliver programming towards holistic green home upgrades for LMI consumers and homeowners, such as weatherization, electrification, and appliance upgrades. And I'll say that these are offered in partnership with our fantastic partner, Inclusive, the membership organization for credit unions that also works to support communities of practice of graduates of these programs. In the fall, we'll be offering a course in community engagement for lenders towards, again, climate and green-related investments. So look for those. At the website as well, we offer trainings in commercial solar. There's one for lenders, one for developers, multifamily decarb for solar and storage. And for those just getting started, we have a free self-paced 2 to 4 hour introduction to solar finance that builds on a lot of the concepts and is a platform for the residential clean energy products that have been the subject of this conversation. So Lisa, if you could put my contact information in there as well, I'd be delighted to speak with anyone further. The collaboration in training and technical assistance is going to be the way for us to reach scale and to go deeply into communities as well. And we look forward to working with you.
Thanks so much, UC. I shared the link in the chat, and I will share her contact information once I'm turning to Q&A first, just to make sure we have someone talking. Let's start with, oh, perfect. Let's start with Ryan. There was a question in the chat on, it seems like California's annual savings from solar should be much higher due to their high utility rates. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Yeah. And I think the quick answer is that the California net metering 3.0 going into effect decreased the compensation homeowners get for selling back to the grid. So for those systems, it has lower operating savings than say it would have a year ago. So that's why you might see lower savings there in that specific case. And then in general, in the interface, you can also select a specific utility and utility tariff if you want to get more nuanced in terms of the payback in PG&E in California or Excel in Colorado, for example.
Thanks, Ryan. And then the next question I think is for me. There's one on are only nonprofit organizations eligible for rebate programs? So I'm assuming this is referring to the home energy rebate programs. And actually it's for homeowners. So this is for, and what's interesting here is that it is eligible for renters as well if they are able to get their homeowner approval. And then it's also for large or for multifamily projects as well. So it could be the owners of multifamily projects or even aggregators. And so like an aggregator could be someone that's pulling together a bunch of different a bunch of different projects. So it's actually not super eligible for nonprofit organizations, more for the homeowners to be aware of. There was also a question in the chat that I answered really briefly, but I want to expand on. There was one on whether solar for all allowed energy efficiency as an enabling upgrade. That was actually a huge win. Originally, it did not include energy efficiency as an enabling upgrade. And I know a lot of organizations spent time trying to get that into the final notice for funding opportunity. And so you can fund energy efficiency through Solar for All. Enabling upgrades can only be 20% of the project cost, so there are some guardrails. But that is incredibly important because energy efficiency can reduce the size of the solar panels, and it can make these projects more cost effective and make the homes healthier and more comfortable as well. Let's see. There was also another question for me. Sorry, I feel like I'm asking myself questions and then answering them around the timing of the IRA rebate programs. So this question was, do you know when the home IRA rebate programs will actually be available to homeowners? My understanding is it's supposed to be this year, but the details still need to be worked out. So this is, DOE does have a tracking resource of kind of where all the states are at in the process. I'll link it in the chat. But pretty much the states will apply for admin funding. And so that's how you know they're kind of working on it. And then they'll submit an application. There are 4 states that have submitted applications for the home electrification rebate program. To date, no states have submitted for the home efficiency rebate program. That's not because they're not going to, it's just a more complex program, so it'll take a little bit more time. But our current thinking is that a few states will have programs that come online probably at the end of 2024, but I think most states will actually have programs come online in 2025 because the application deadline is January of 2025. So if they apply to DOE needs to review it. Probably like the latest a program would come online is the end of 2025. Whitney, Ryan, I'm wondering if you could, are there other questions in the chat that I'm not seeing?
Lisa, there's one on, are there practical ways with existing or newer programs for tenants to economically benefit, given that they are generally lower income than homeowners? So more of a renter question.
Yeah, this is definitely tricky. Rewiring America actually put out a really good resource on this that is talking about how, because the home energy rebate programs are available to tenants, and they put out some resources on how tenants could take advantage of that. So in our follow-up, I'll link to that because I don't think I'll be able to do it justice in the next minute. But I think the longer answer is it's certainly more difficult for leased homes to benefit from clean energy projects. And so innovative financing models are going to need to be created to really think about that specific use case. With that, I'm seeing we're at time. So I want to thank all the panelists for joining and thank all the participants for coming and for all your great questions. And as I said at the beginning, we will share the slides and the recording with you within the next 24 hours. Thank you, and we'll see what happens with GGRF in the coming days. Hopefully we'll have some exciting announcements coming soon. All right, bye.